Before we start tonight, I want to tell you plainly what this story involves. We're going back to Boston in the early 1960s, into small apartments and triple-decker houses where women were found murdered in their own homes. We're going to talk about sexual assault, strangulation, and a city living with the knowledge that someone was breaking in and killing women behind locked doors. I'm not going to dwell on graphic, gory details. That's not the point. But the crimes themselves are violent, and the victims are almost all women, many of them elderly or living alone. If that's not something you can handle right now, it is completely okay to click away. Take care of yourself first. If you stay, I want to keep the focus on a few key questions. What really happened in Boston between 1962 and 1964? Who was Albert DeSalvo, the man who confessed to being the Boston Strangler? And even after DNA, court cases, and decades of books and movies, why are so many people still uneasy about the idea that one man killed all those women? Let's start in the summer of 1962. Try to picture Boston back then. It's not the glossy tech and college city you might picture today. The elevated Central Artery still cuts through downtown. Neighborhoods like Dorchester, Roxbury, and the South End are dense with triple-decker houses, tenements, and small apartments. The city's still adjusting to post-war life. Catholic families, immigrants, working-class people, all living on top of each other, dealing with changing morals and rising crime. Air conditioning isn't widespread. Windows are open in summer. People lean on their screens, listening to radio ball games and neighborhood gossip. And then, in June 1962, something happens that will change the feel of the city for years. On June 14, 1962, in an apartment in the Back Bay, a 55-year-old woman named Anna Sleezers doesn't answer the phone. She doesn't show up where she's supposed to. Her son comes to check on her. He finds the apartment door locked from the outside, but he has a key. He goes in. He finds his mother dead in the bathroom. She's been sexually assaulted and strangled, her body left in a degrading position. The belt from her bathrobe is tight around her neck, tied in a bow. From the very beginning, that bow becomes part of the story. It's not just strangulation. It's strangulation with a ligature tied in a particular way, almost like someone wanted to leave a signature. The police come. They process the scene as best they can, in a world before DNA, before modern crime scene protocols. They interview neighbors, ask about strange men, check for signs of forced entry. There aren't any. And then life moves on. It's a horrendous crime, but at that moment, there's no way to know it's the beginning of something bigger. 2 weeks later, on June 30th, 68-year-old Nina Nichols is found dead in her Boston apartment. She's been strangled with her own stockings, tied around her neck. The apartment doesn't show obvious signs of forced entry. On the same day, miles away in Lynn, Massachusetts, 65-year-old Helen Blake is discovered murdered in her home. Same kind of apartment, same sort of woman, living alone, older. She's been strangled with multiple ligatures, again using clothing and household items. There's evidence of sexual assault. This time, police start to connect dots. 3 older women, all living alone, all in the greater Boston area, all strangled, all left in sexually degrading positions, all with ligatures tied in conspicuous knots. Detectives begin to suspect a pattern. Remember, this is 1962. The term serial killer isn't in everyday usage. Profiling the way we think of it now doesn't exist yet. But cops are still human. They know when something feels like the work of one person. The newspapers pick up on the fear. Boston in the early 1960s has a fierce tabloid competition. Reporters are hungry for scoops. Journalists like Loretta McLaughlin and Jean Cole start digging into the pattern of the murders. Headlines use phrases like "mad strangler." Articles outline the victims' lives and describe a mysterious killer targeting spinster, women living alone. Pretty soon, one name sticks: the Boston Strangler. Over the next 2 years, a string of murders will be linked, accurately or not, to that label. The early victims fit a certain profile: older, single, or widowed women, living alone in small apartments. Many are of modest means. They're the kind of people neighbors might describe as quiet, kept to herself, a nice lady. Time after time, the picture is similar: no obvious sign of forced entry, suggesting the killer either talked his way in, was let in, or had some way of bluffing authority, posing as a maintenance worker, delivery man, or someone official. Once inside, he sexually assaults the victim, strangles her with whatever's at hand: stockings, belts, scarves, and sometimes arranges the body. The ligature is often tied in a conspicuous knot or bow, almost like a calling card. You can imagine what this does to the psychology of a city. If you're an older woman living alone in Boston, suddenly your front door feels like tissue paper. You double-check your locks, then check them again. Maybe you start putting a chair under the doorknob. You look through the peephole before you open it. You hesitate before answering at all. If you're her neighbor, you offer to check in on her. If you're her adult child, you call more often, maybe urge her to move in with you. Meanwhile, the investigation is struggling. This is pre-computer, pre-DNA, pre-coordinated databases. Boston and the surrounding towns are carved into jurisdictions: Boston PD, suburban departments, the state police. Communication between them is uneven. One department might not fully share everything with another. There's no single, giant case file automatically available to every detective. On top of that, there are biases. Some investigators refer to the early victims as lonely old women, almost pitying. Later, when younger women are killed, and some are suspected of having more active sex lives, the tone shifts in a harsher direction. More judgment, more moralizing. As the murders pile up, the victim profile starts to change. By late 1962 and into 1963, the women being killed are younger, some in their 20s, living in different kinds of neighborhoods. There's more variety in race, class, and lifestyle. The pattern that looked so clear at first starts to blur. Is this still the same killer? Or is Boston Strangler becoming a catch-all label the press and police use for any unsolved strangulation of a woman in the area? That question will haunt the case for decades. By the time the Strangler panic had run its course, authorities had linked 13 murders to him, roughly between 1962 and 1964. Whether that number is too high, too low, or just wrong is part of what we'll get into. But for now, imagine the city in the middle of that wave. Women change their routines. Churches preach about safety and morality. People buy new locks. Hardware stores run out of certain door chains. Families argue about whether grandma should keep living alone. Every unknown knock on the door feels like a threat. Police are under intense pressure to do something, anything, that looks like progress. They issue warnings. They check out tip after tip. They arrest and release suspicious men. They question ex-boyfriends, handymen, delivery drivers, door-to-door salesmen, and anyone who seems even remotely off. But month after month, there's no arrest that holds. The Boston Strangler feels like a ghost. To really understand why Albert DeSalvo's later confession was so powerful and so controversial, you have to know who he was before anyone ever called him the Strangler. Albert DeSalvo was born in 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, just across the river from Boston. He grew up in a chaotic household with a physically abusive father. There was poverty. There was violence. There was not a lot of stability. As a teenager, he committed petty crimes, theft, breaking and entering small-time trouble. He joined the army, served time in the military, then came back to Massachusetts and bounced between odd jobs. Construction work, factory work, whatever he could find. He got married. He had children. From the outside, at least sometimes, he looked like a regular working-class guy trying to get by. But behind closed doors, DeSalvo had a long-standing pattern of sexual deviance and predatory behavior. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, he committed a series of sexual assaults that have their own nickname in true crime circles: the Measuring Man and the Green Man cases. First, as the so-called Measuring Man, he would pose as a talent scout or modeling agent. He'd approach young women, often in shopping centers or public places, and tell them they had the right measurements for fashion or modeling work. He'd convince them to let him measure them, sometimes in semi-private or private spaces, under the guise of professional assessment. Then, the encounter would turn sexual and coercive. Later, as the Green Man, he escalated. He started breaking into women's apartments, often wearing green work clothes like a maintenance worker. He would hold them at knife point, tie them up, and sexually assault them. Many of these attacks did not end in murder. They were terrifying, but the victims survived. In 1964, DeSalvo is arrested for the Green Man rapes. One of his potential victims had managed to fight back, giving police a description of him and his methods. Once he's in custody, other victims identify him. The pattern becomes clear. He is a prolific serial sexual predator. He's not, at that moment, being arrested as the Boston Strangler. He's being arrested as a rapist. He's sent to Bridgewater State Hospital, a secure psychiatric facility, for evaluation. This is where the Strangler story takes a sharp, strange turn. In Bridgewater, DeSalvo meets another inmate, George Nasser. Nasser is a convicted murderer, intelligent, manipulative, and familiar with the criminal system. The two men talk. They share stories. They both know Boston is haunted by unsolved murders, and that there's reward money on the table for information leading to the strangler. One day, Nasser goes to his attorney, a young, ambitious lawyer named F. Lee Bailey. Nasser tells Bailey, "There's a guy here who says he's the Boston Strangler. That guy is Albert DeSalvo." Bailey meets with DeSalvo, and DeSalvo starts to confess. He tells Bailey he's the man behind the Boston Strangler murders. He describes going into apartments, talking his way in, strangling women with their own clothing, tying the knots, and leaving them arranged in specific ways. He rattles off details that match some crime scenes. Bailey sees an opportunity. Not the one you might think. Remember, DeSalvo is already facing serious charges for the Green Man rapes. At that time, Massachusetts could still impose the death penalty for certain crimes. If he's convicted of multiple rapes and suspected of murder, he could very realistically end up on death row. Bailey's strategy is both bold and morally complicated. Have DeSalvo confess to the Boston Strangler murders, not in open court, initially, but in controlled settings. Use that confession to argue that he's mentally ill, that he has this compulsion that drove him to rape and possibly murder, and that he should be found legally insane and sent to a hospital rather than executed. In other words, Bailey thinks he can save DeSalvo's life by leaning into the horror of the Strangler confessions, then flipping them into a mental health argument. At the same time, if DeSalvo really is the Strangler, the city gets closure. The families get answers. The police get their man. The press gets their headline. It's a seductive narrative. Boston police and the Attorney General's office are, at first, cautious. They've had false confessions before. The Strangler case is famous enough that a certain kind of person might claim credit just to feel important. They listen, they compare, they check. DeSalvo's confessions are detailed, but not perfect. In some cases, he's eerily accurate, describing the layout of an apartment, where a piece of furniture was, how the body was positioned, what ligature was used. In others, he gets dates wrong, or misremembers the order of victims, or confuses certain details that only investigators knew. How much does that matter? Well, it depends on what you're looking for. If you're desperate for an answer, any answer, you might focus on the details he gets right and chalk the mistakes up to the fallibility of memory or the passage of time. If you're more skeptical, you might ask, how did he learn the details he gets right? Were crime scene descriptions leaked in the press? Could he have heard things from other inmates, from guards, from investigators themselves? And then there's George Nasser. Some people, over the years, have wondered, was Nasser feeding DeSalvo information? Coaching him? Maybe even coaxing him to take the fall in exchange for some promise of reward money going to DeSalvo's family? None of that is proven. But in a case where the central narrative hinges on one man's confession, the question of who might have shaped that confession matters. Despite these doubts, the machinery moves forward. Here's an important point that often surprises people. Albert DeSalvo was never put on trial for the Boston Strangler murders. He was never formally convicted of a single Strangler murder in a court of law. Instead, he went to trial in 1967 for the string of Green Man sexual assaults, dozens of rapes and attempted rapes. The jury heard about his crimes, but not the full Strangler confession narrative. F. Lee Bailey did raise his mental state, and the defense tried to use the unsolved murders to paint a picture of a disturbed mind, but the focus of the charges was the rapes. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. DeSalvo was sent to Walpole State Prison, a maximum security facility. To the public, though, the message was clear. The guy who says he's the Boston Strangler is now locked up forever. The murders stopped years ago. Case closed. And for a lot of people, that was enough. But not for everyone. From the very beginning, there were detectives, reporters, and ordinary citizens who felt uneasy. Part of that unease came from the gaps and mistakes in DeSalvo's confessions. He could describe certain scenes, yes, but sometimes he described details that didn't match the evidence. He conflated aspects of one crime scene with another. He knew things that might have been in newspapers and didn't know things that investigators felt the real killer would absolutely remember. Another source of doubt was the pattern of the murders themselves. The early victims were mostly older women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, living alone in small apartments. Later victims were younger, and one was quite young, a 19-year-old. Some lived in different areas, had different lifestyles. The way they were killed varied in certain specifics. Did that mean the killer was evolving? Possibly. Serial offenders sometimes change their patterns. Or did it mean that Boston Strangler had turned into a bucket in which multiple, potentially unrelated murders were being tossed? Then there's motive. In the Green Man cases, DeSalvo is clearly a sexual predator. He breaks into apartments, ties women up, and rapes them. That's his pattern. In the Strangler murders, the women are not just assaulted, they're killed. Not once, not in a panic moment, but repeatedly. 13 times, if you accept the official count. Why would a man who had successfully assaulted dozens of women without killing them suddenly cross the line into serial murder? Then confess only to the murders, not to the rapes, when the murders carry much greater risk and punishment. Some psychologists have argued that this could make sense, that his urge escalated, that a single humiliation or trigger pushed him over a threshold. You can sketch a story where someone goes from non-lethal sexual assault to sexual homicide. Others point out that there is a difference between DeSalvo's known pattern, rape plus escape, and the Strangler pattern, rape plus murder plus staging the body. They argue that maybe DeSalvo was, at most, responsible for some attacks, not all. And then there's the most basic question of all. If Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, why wasn't the state willing to charge and convict him for those murders in open court? Officially, prosecutors at the time said they were worried the confession wouldn't hold up. There was virtually no physical evidence tying him to the Strangler crime scenes, no fingerprints matched, no eyewitness who could say, "I saw him enter that building that night." They feared that if they went to trial and lost, they'd have a self-confessed serial killer walking free on the murder charges, even if he remained locked up for the rapes. So they took the sure thing, a conviction for the Green Man assaults and a life sentence. But that decision left an odd gap. On paper, in the court system, the Boston Strangler case remains technically unsolved. In the public imagination, Albert DeSalvo became the Strangler anyway. And then in 1973, another twist. On November 25, 1973, DeSalvo is stabbed to death in the infirmary at Walpole State Prison. He's 42 years old. The murder is never fully solved. There are theories that he was killed over drugs, over gambling, over debts, or to keep him from talking more about certain crimes. Some people speculate that other inmates were simply tired of his constant talking and boasting. Whatever the reason, he dies without ever having stood trial for a single Strangler murder. If the story ended there, we'd be left with a confessed killer dead in prison, a string of unsolved murders on the books, and a city that wants closure. But remember, science doesn't stand still. In the 1960s, investigators didn't have DNA analysis. They had blood types, hair microscopy, semen under a microscope, and not much else. After his death, DeSalvo's body was buried. The crime scene evidence from the Strangler cases sat in storage for decades. In the 1990s and 2000s, DNA technology changed the game. Old cases around the world were being re-examined. Evidence that had sat in envelopes and boxes for decades was pulled out, swabbed, and processed. New genetic profiles emerged, confirming some confessions, shattering others, and sometimes identifying completely new suspects. In Boston, attention turned to one of the Strangler's most famous victims, Mary Sullivan. Mary was 19 years old when she was found murdered in January 1964 in her apartment on Charles Street. She'd recently moved to Boston, full of hope about starting adult life in the city. Her death was brutal and sexually degrading. Photos of the crime scene circulated in the press and later in books. Her case became almost symbolic of the Boston Strangler story. Over the years, some people became convinced that DeSalvo did not kill Mary. A former FBI agent named Robert Ressler and others raised questions about the evidence. Mary's family, understandably, wanted clarity. In the early 2000s, her body was exhumed by private investigators hired by her family. They did their own forensic analysis and claimed that certain injuries were inconsistent with the official narrative. Books came out arguing that DeSalvo was innocent of her murder, raising alternative suspects, pointing to possible police errors. The waters got muddier. Then in 2013, Massachusetts authorities did something definitive. They took DNA from biological evidence preserved from Mary Sullivan's crime scene. Specifically, seminal fluid found on a blanket or other material associated with the body. They developed a genetic profile of the contributor. They then obtained a sample of DNA from one of DeSalvo's relatives, a nephew, to see if there was a familial match. This is the same kind of technique now used in genealogical investigations. The result showed a very high probability that the crime scene DNA came from a male in DeSalvo's paternal line. That was strong, but not yet absolutely conclusive. So they went further. With a court order and the family's involvement, they exhumed Albert DeSalvo's body from his grave. They took bone and tooth samples, extracted his DNA, and compared it directly to the DNA from Mary's case. It matched. Not a familial, could be someone in his family match. A direct, individual match. That means this, barring some extraordinary laboratory error or contamination, the man who sexually assaulted Mary Sullivan was Albert DeSalvo. So does that settle it? Is that the end of the debate? Yes and no. The DNA confirmation tells us something important and concrete. Albert DeSalvo almost certainly murdered Mary Sullivan. It also strongly suggests that his confession wasn't pure fantasy. He wasn't just some random guy claiming to be the strangler with no connection to any of the crime scenes. He was connected, by DNA, to at least one of the canonical Boston Strangler murders. For many people, that's enough to say, okay, that's it. He was the strangler. But if you look closely, there's a limit to what that DNA can tell us. It only directly connects him to one victim. Crime scene evidence from the early 1960s was not always collected or preserved perfectly. In some of the other strangler cases, there may not be testable DNA left. Even if there is, it might be degraded, contaminated, or incomplete. So DNA can confirm that DeSalvo killed at least one woman attributed to the strangler. It cannot, on its own, prove that he killed all 13. This is where the lingering doubts live. There are a few main schools of thought. 1. DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler. He committed all 13 murders, plus maybe some others that were never linked. The differences in victim type or method are just variations in his behavior or the result of poor early reporting. 2. DeSalvo was responsible for some of the murders, maybe especially the later ones, including Mary Sullivan, but not all. The early wave of older women may have been killed by a different man. Over time, the pattern got muddied, and investigators and the media lumped everything together under one label. 3. DeSalvo did not commit any of the Strangler murders, and the DNA result is either misinterpreted, contaminated, or linked to some other kind of contact with Mary Sullivan. In this view, the real strangler was someone else, possibly someone like George Nassar, or an unknown predator who died or went underground without ever confessing. The third view has gotten a lot weaker since the DNA test, but you will still find people who promote it, often tied to alternative suspect theories. The second view, multiple offenders, is the one that most serious skeptics and cautious investigators gravitate toward. It recognizes the DNA evidence. It acknowledges that DeSalvo was clearly a violent sexual offender capable of murder. But it also respects the original crime scene differences, the confession inconsistencies, and the messy way Boston Strangler became more of a media umbrella term than a precise investigative label. Why does this matter? Why, decades later, do people still argue about who did what? Part of it is justice, in the narrow sense. Families of victims deserve as accurate an answer as we can give them. Some guy confessed isn't enough if the evidence doesn't fully back it up. Part of it is justice in a broader, systemic sense. The Boston Strangler case is a vivid example of something we see over and over in true crime. When a city is terrified, when the press is screaming for answers, when the public is desperate for closure, there's enormous pressure on police and prosecutors to find a story that ties everything together with a bow. A neat story. A single villain. One man killed all these women, and now that man is locked up. That narrative is emotionally satisfying. It gives us a clear arc: horror, fear, pursuit, confession, imprisonment, the end. It also fits our brain's tendency toward what psychologists call the need for closure. We don't like unresolved questions. We like simple, tidy answers, even when the reality is more complicated. But reality often is more complicated. Sometimes multiple predators operate in the same region at the same time. Sometimes a killer's confession is partly true and partly self-serving fantasy. Sometimes unrelated crimes get marketed under a single nickname because it's easier to sell newspapers, and now podcasts and documentaries, if there's one label and one face. The Boston Strangler story sits right at that crossroads. On one hand, you have a city genuinely terrorized, women staying home at night, older ladies sleeping with chairs under their doorknobs, families begging their mothers and grandmothers to move in, all because someone was killing women in their apartments. On the other hand, you have a man like DeSalvo, clearly dangerous, clearly capable of violence, but whose exact role in that reign of terror is fuzzier the closer you look. You have police under immense pressure, sorting through thousands of tips without modern technology, doing some things well and making huge mistakes in others. You have a legal system that chose not to test the strangler confession in open court. You have a lawyer who, understandably, wanted to save his client from the death penalty and was willing to lean into the strangler story to do it. And you have decades of pop culture, books, movies, TV shows that have smoothed all of that complexity into something simple and punchy. Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler. So, who really killed the women of Boston? If you want a short answer, it's this. We know, with modern scientific confidence, that Albert DeSalvo raped and murdered at least one of the women associated with the Boston Strangler, Mary Sullivan. Given his pattern of sexual violence, it's reasonable to believe he may have killed others as well. But beyond that, the tidy narrative that one man, operating alone, committed all the murders that were ever linked to the Strangler nickname is less certain. Some of those killings may have been the work of different men, targeting different victims, folded into the Strangler legend because they fit a broad pattern of woman, dead, strangled in Boston. That uncertainty is uncomfortable. We like our serial killer stories with clear beginnings and ends. But in real life, especially in older cases, messiness is the rule, not the exception. So as you sit with this case, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. First, about victims. It's easy when a case is famous to let the nickname swallow the names. The Boston Strangler becomes the headline, the image on the screen. The women become a list, a montage, a series of black and white photos. But each of those women was someone's mother, sister, aunt, neighbor, co-worker. They had routines and favorite shows and small daily frustrations and plans for next week that never happened. They did not sign up to be part of a legend. They were going about their lives in a city that told them their homes were their castles, and that belief turned out not to be true. Second, about systems. When we get to the end of a story like this and say, well, at least the guy who did some of it was locked up, we can let a lot of institutional failure slide by. Would all of those murders have been lumped together today in the same way? Would modern investigative tools have connected some and excluded others? Would DNA taken at the time have clearly shown multiple offenders? We can't know for sure, but we can say this. The tools and mindsets we use to investigate crimes shape the stories we tell afterward. If you start with the assumption there must be one killer, you will bend a lot of evidence to fit that. If you start with the humility that evil can come from multiple corners, you're more likely to keep an open mind. Third, about closure. There's a reason cases like the Boston Strangler stick around in the cultural memory for so long. They tap into primal fears. The fear of being attacked in your own home. The fear that the person responsible might still be unnamed. The fear that the official story might not be the true story. When someone finally confesses, it's tempting to breathe out and say, okay, done. Case closed. But as true crime listeners and as citizens, we have to be careful not to let our need for closure pull us into certainty that the evidence can't quite support. Sometimes, the most honest ending we can offer is not a neat period at the end of the sentence, but a question mark. Who really killed the women of Boston? A violent man named Albert DeSalvo, beyond any reasonable doubt, killed at least one of them, and probably more. Did he kill all the women whose deaths were stamped with the Boston Strangler label? That part of the story is still, even now, not completely settled. And maybe that lingering doubt, that gap between what we want to believe and what we can prove, is exactly what this case is trying to show us. That justice isn't just about catching a killer. It's about being willing to live with the complexity of the truth, even when all we want is a simple answer we can turn into a headline. Wherever you're listening from tonight, maybe in your car, maybe alone in your room, I'd ask you to take a second and think not about the nickname, but about those apartments, those quiet hallways, those women who opened their doors to someone they probably thought they could trust. Think about how many of them were never really given the dignity of a clear, individual answer. And remember that when you hear a story neatly tied up with a bow, especially in true crime, it's always fair to ask, is that the truth, or just the simplest version we've decided we can live with?